Good morning. Welcome to Berkshire Family History Presents. Today's guest is Barry Emery, a well-known historian, lecturer, and author who has written several books about Cheshire's history. Barry will be talking about his book, The History of Cheshire's Incorporation and Their Many Unusual Corners. I'm kind of interested to hear about those corners. So, welcome, Barry.
Thank you, Angela, for having me. It's my pleasure to always talk about Cheshire's history. It's become a passion of mine ever since I retired.
Okay, have you always lived in Cheshire, Barry?
No, I first came to Berkshire County in 1969 as a teacher, and I wasn't married. I lived in a couple of different towns, but since I've been married for the last 50 years or so, I've been in Cheshire.
Okay.
It's my adopted home.
That's beautiful. Now, what was your initial adventure getting into Cheshire history? How did that begin?
So, after I retired, I thought I'd do a little hiking on the Appalachian Trail.
Mm-hmm.
And when you hike on the Appalachian Trail, it goes right through the center of Cheshire. And there's a corner of Cheshire right on that trail. And I thought, well, gee, wouldn't it be interesting to see how they mark the corner of towns? So as I hiked, I got to that spot and I looked for a pile of stones or a wooden marker or something that would indicate that's the corner between Dalton and Cheshire. And I couldn't find it.
Oh.
And that led me to doing research to where is that corner and how are those corners marked. And in this first book, the shape of Cheshire is very unusual. In fact, at one time, a newspaper article called us the crookedest town in Massachusetts because of that unusual shape. I eventually found all 22 corners of Cheshire. And I needed to find out, well, why are we so oddly shaped? And it turns out that in 1766, a group of men, two men actually, from Providence, Rhode Island, bought that area, and they started migrating from Providence to Cheshire. In fact, it was named New Providence, and they were all Baptists. And in 1793, when we became a town, they seemed to put the boundaries so that the Baptist farms were part of Cheshire and the non-Baptists went to Lanesborough or Adams or Windsor. In fact, one little corner of Cheshire incorporated a couple of farms from Windsor, and a year later those farmers petitioned the state to go back to Windsor because they didn't want to be part of that Baptist town.
Oh.
So that's the reason that we're so oddly shaped. It had to do with that religion. And religion was your life back then.
Yes. Everything gravitated about that. Yeah. So when you started doing this research, obviously that was one of the issues that came up. But you talked about the corners, and you mentioned a minute ago the shape of this. I got to face it this way. There we go. You said you couldn't find any stones or markers. Are there anything there? Is there a stone or marker now?
So, eventually I found all 22 corners, and then they're marked with field stones, most of them.
What is that?
So it's a stone that usually stands about 4 or 5 feet high. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's a jagged piece of stone. Other times it's more of a shaped piece of granite. Mm-hmm. And many of them were knocked over by trees falling on them.
Yeah, sure.
So my friend Rick Salvi and I spent a couple of summers going out into the woods trying to find those markers. In fact, when I told the Cheshire Selectmen what I was doing for a project, I told them that, there's a state law that every 5 years you're supposed to be checking on those. Oh, really? You are now the official town perambulator.
Yeah, right. So you got a job.
Yeah, so I got a job for life. They're not so important anymore because of the GPS things that we have.
Yeah. Now, were most of these markers that you did find buried in woods, and that was the reason
they were out in the middle of nowhere.
Really?
And at one time we were mostly fields, but in the last 150 years, that's all been grown over.
Yeah.
And so it took some finding, some searching to find those stones.
Yeah. So when you started this project, a job, where did you get your research from?
the internet is the savior today to doing research.
That's very true.
I could find books that were in libraries all over the country that helped me to do my research. And while I was researching the corners of Cheshire, I found some interesting mysteries about Cheshire. And so that led me to a second book called Historical Mysteries of Cheshire.
Okay.
But let me tell you first about how Cheshire, more about how it got started. When those two men from Rhode Island bought the land, they hired a surveyor. Job Stafford is his name. And there's a place in Cheshire still known as Stafford's Hill. Well, Job came up and surveyed the land, and more and more people from Rhode Island started to come to this area. They were all Baptists. They fought in the Revolutionary War. In fact, Job Stafford led people up to the Battle of Bennington, and he helped win that battle. Yes. And so when our country was first formed, they wanted to become part of that, and they wanted to be an official town. For 17 years, they petitioned the state of Massachusetts to become a town, and for 17 years, they were turned down. It was finally in 1793 that we finally became a town.
A town.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So when you began your research, that was one of the aspects of history that you incorporated. But aside from these fantastic shapes and markers that you were talking about, I see you have another book here. Would you like to talk about this book, Barry?
Okay. So, you know, Cheshire has two very famous people. One of them is Job Stafford, who I just mentioned, and he was famous because of his fighting in the Revolutionary War. The other famous person is Elder John Leland, and he's pictured on my book here with James Madison. And let me tell you a little bit about Leland and this book. So Leland lived in Virginia, and he was a Baptist minister there. And James Madison, who wrote the Constitution of the United States, wanted to get it adopted in Virginia. And he came to Leland and said, I need your help. You're the most influential person in this part of Virginia. Will you help me get this adopted? And Leland said to Madison at the time, no, it does not have enough guarantees of individual freedoms. And so Leland and Madison had these debates about this lacking issue of the Constitution. And Madison said, I promise you, if you help me get this adopted in Virginia, I will add something to the Constitution to guarantee these individual freedoms. And we now have the Bill of Rights. And it was Elder John Leland that's responsible for that.
Interesting.
Very soon afterwards, he came to Cheshire and became our Baptist minister for 40 years.
Yes.
So he is a famous person in Cheshire's history.
That. Yes.
Now, Leland was also influential in terms of he knew Thomas Jefferson. So when Jefferson got elected, he said he wanted to do something special to commemorate the event. And he got the farmers of Cheshire, who are already making a lot of cheese, to create this 1,235-pound piece of cheese.
Oh, my.
And it was known as the Mammoth Cheese. And they took it to Washington, D.C., and presented it to Jefferson on the steps of the White House, January 1st, 1802.
Oh, my goodness.
And at the time, it was something that enthralled the whole nation. Every newspaper in the country was writing articles about this cheese that was making its way to Washington, D.C.
Oh, for goodness sake.
And let me tell you, Angela, that recently we put a big full-size replica of that cheese near the Ashwiltacook Rail Trail in Cheshire, right by the post office.
Yes.
So if you ever want to see what that cheese looked like, go take a look at that replica.
I can't believe that. They actually transported it from Cheshire to Washington. Must have been on a big cart of some sort.
It was a horrendous job. The first step was to get it to Kinderhook, New York, because they wanted to get it on the Hudson River. Now, Kinderhook's 43 miles from Cheshire. They did it with oxen. They only travel about 1.5 miles an hour. So it took them 3 days just to get from Cheshire over to Kinderhook, New York. And then it got taken to New York City. It spent a couple of days there, and people from all over came to look at this cheese. And so eventually it got on a boat and it ended up in Baltimore, and then from Baltimore to Washington. So it was quite a journey.
I was thinking it would be rather ripe by then.
Well, it was cured, of course,
Okay.
in Cheshire, so it wasn't something that was going to spoil. In fact, it stayed in the White House for over 3 years.
Really?
And people who would come, Jefferson, and would give them pieces of cheese, you know, to try.
That's wonderful.
When I tried to find out what eventually happened to it, there's one story that says it got so ripe they just threw the rest of it in the Potomac River.
Yeah,
so,
the mice ate it, right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's grand. Now, you mentioned that Cheshire had been making cheese. It was a farming community. Is there any cheese making going on now, or have we gone past that?
Yeah, we've gone past that. I'm going to tell you that one of my books is called Made in Cheshire. And we were famous for several different commodities. Cheese was definitely one of them. We had probably 5 or 6 companies making cheese in the mid-18 to late 1800s. They're all gone now. But cheese was definitely one of our most famous products. The other was sand. In the middle part of the 1800s, a man was trying to put a water wheel next to a stream, and every time he dug, sand was coming into the hole. And he got fascinated by the sand, and for some reason he sent a sample to Boston, and it was assayed as the finest, purest quartz that anybody had ever seen. And so for the next 50 or 60 years, we shipped sand to glass factories all over the world. So we didn't make much glass in Cheshire, although we did have a glass factory at one time, but we had sand that everybody wanted.
That's
And
marvelous.
so that was one of our famous products.
What a surprise that turned out to be.
Yeah,
huh?
it certainly was.
Yeah.
So that was the second famous product that Cheshire had. And if you go to the glass factory on Cape Cod, it's in Sandwich.
Yes.
You will find glass made with Cheshire sand. And they have a little display there showing you. And it was always used for the finest glass because it was so pure.
Oh my,
Yeah.
that's interesting. See, I never knew that.
Yep. we shipped more goods by railroad than any other town in Western Mass except Springfield.
Yes.
In the late 1800s.
Yes,
And
yes.
sand was, of course, one of that.
Yes.
Lumber.
Yeah.
But the third famous product that we have is lime. So,
Oh, yes, yes.
yeah,
yes,
these two gentlemen who came back from the Civil War started a lime company, Albert and Alfred Farnham.
Okay.
And they started this huge lime company by Cheshire Reservoir.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, that section of Cheshire is still known as Farnham's. Because
Yes, there's a street there for Farnham's Crossing.
the causeway, goes across there.
Yeah.
Well, the factory's gone now, but they were producing lime for many, many years, and at the time, New York City was starting to grow, and they needed lime for plaster.
Yes.
And so we had a product called Blue Label Lime, and that's what was used for most of the plaster in the New York City for years.
More information. I never knew this about Cheshire.
Yeah,
That's
so we were
marvelous.
very famous for our lime.
Yeah.
Now, I want to tell you one other thing about Cheshire
Sure.
that I discovered that is going to be in my latest book. We have a very nice home in Cheshire called the Greylock Villa. It was built in the mid-1800s. And it turns out that after I gave a talk about Cheshire's homes, this woman came up to me and said, well, did you hear about the rumor about Cheshire, about Greylock Villa? And I said, no. Well, it used to be a house of prostitution.
Ooh.
Never heard that rumor. So I did some research, and it turned out that one of the famous madams from New York City bought that home. And she was eventually arrested, and my research showed that she did own that home for 10 years.
Oh my.
So I don't think it was ever used for that purpose, but I can imagine that some of her girls came up and vacationed there.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm sure walking around Cheshire, they stood out.
Oh, that's remarkable. So you never knew that about
I
that?
never knew that about the Greylock Villa in Cheshire.
and that-
But that home is still there on Richardson Street in Cheshire.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's a house that's just being used for your purposes, right?
Yeah. Now it's just a
regular residence.
Just a regular residence.
Yeah. Now, you've done so much research, especially about Cheshire. Where did you find the information that you had to dig through to do this?
So one of my hobbies, you might say, is to digitize any old documents I can find. And so I became a member of the Historical Commission, and I would go up to their room, and I would take my camera or my scanner, and I'd go through boxes of documents, and I'd digitize them by either taking a photograph or scanning them. I'm up to over 20,000 items now.
Wow.
And when people knew I was doing this, they would invite me to their home. And so I have a huge collection of old postcards that someone let me scan and digitize.
That's remarkable.
So many of my facts about Cheshire came from these documents that I was scanning, and of course while I'm doing it I'm reading them and finding out more about Cheshire's history.
Right. Now when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that a woman in the area in Cheshire invited you to her home to look at some papers she had stored, and there were Civil War letters?
Yes, so Elaine Daniels had kept many family documents, and she invited me one day to go look at them. And one of them was a series of letters that this gentleman, his name was George Lewis, and he lived in Cheshire at the time, and his wife Lucy was there. So while he was serving in the Civil War, it was the 169th Regiment, I believe, from New York, because he had been in Hoosick Falls. So when he first got into the Army, he was in New York. But anyway, he wrote these letters back to Lucy. And each letter is 4 or 5 pages long, telling about what it was like camping there, and what the battles were going on, and the weather, and what they were eating, and they're fascinating. So they're going to be part of my next book.
I hope so, because that's such wonderful, rich history that we'll lose unless we read it and see it.
Yeah,
Yes.
and so I'm happy to go to anybody's home and look at whatever they have.
Well, speaking of that, you mentioned you're starting or writing now your 8th book, am I correct?
It's the 8th book, yes.
Now, you've got a lot of books here, so can you talk about some of your books?
Well, this
Give us an outline.
This one's kind of interesting. So this book is entitled The History of Cheshire. And in 1885, these two ladies wrote this very, very detailed history. And if I want to find out something prior to 1885, this is one of my sources. It turned out Barnes & Noble was selling this book, and I thought, well, wait a minute, how can they be selling a book that somebody else wrote? Well, the book is out of copyright. And the book is page after page of just text, not a single picture or map in the book. Well, I got the idea that if they could sell it, then maybe I could add stuff to it, and I would sell it. So in the back of the book, I've added 30 or 40 pages of pictures, of photographs of what the book is talking about, as well as maps. And it became a fundraiser for the Council on Aging. So that was a neat little project.
Perfect.
Then I mentioned earlier that I had done The Made in Cheshire. And so this book is all about our industry. And we were pretty famous for some of the products, as I mentioned earlier. I'll tell you about my latest book. Because I give a talk every year about Cheshire's history, they wanted me to do something special for our 225th anniversary. So I made a walking tour of Cheshire where we went around, and I had these old photographs, and we'd get to a spot and I'd say, okay, this is what you're seeing today, but what would you see 150 years ago? So here's an example. I'll turn to one of the pages. So here's a picture of the Cheshire Reservoir. Well, here's a picture of it from 150 years, well, not 100 years ago. And when we got to a place near the town hall, I would show a picture like this. So, and it just shows you the industry that we had way back, and then what it looked like more recently. And so I took those photographs and put them in the book, so that as you turn in that book you'll see what was and what is.
Yes, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
Now, the photographs you found through your various journeys and looking about and finding them in people's homes, how long have you been doing this, Barry?
So in 2004, I retired as a teacher.
Okay.
Decided to do that hiking.
Okay.
And basically, that started me on this journey.
So-
And so for basically the last 15 years or so, I've taken the information and given annual lectures.
Yes.
And some of those are up on YouTube, so you
That's
can
wonderful.
see them.
Yeah.
I'm giving one this summer. We
Yes.
can talk about that later
Yeah,
if you'd
yeah.
like. But it's been since I retired.
So everybody in Cheshire should know Barry when he comes knocking at their door
Yeah.
and say, "What do you got in the attic?"
That's right. That's the way I've come across a lot of items.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, when you save this stuff, it's in a closet somewhere.
I know.
And my job is to get it digitized
And safe.
and there for the future.
yeah.
Now I've given the Athenaeum and the Cheshire Library copies of all these documents.
Mm-hmm.
And so if anybody wants to do research on Cheshire, you can go to those libraries and you can ask to look at the Cheshire archive that I've put together.
Excellent, excellent. Oh, what a choice. What a valuable history you have here. That's remarkable. And you obviously enjoy it. I can hear it in your voice.
Yeah, it's a passion.
Yeah, it
It's
is a passion.
Yeah.
And just when you think you've found everything, there's more to find.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I'm like I say, I'm working on my 8th book, and it's going to update you on some of the mysteries that I've had in the past. So it's going to be called the second volume of Historical Mysteries of Cheshire.
Okay,
So,
okay.
yeah.
You know, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned something, and I just want to talk briefly about it. The shape of the boundary, and it is a rather, I can never get this straight. I'll get it right. There it is. It's an unusual shape with lots of ins and outs and ins and out. And you asked me if I could figure out what that shape meant, and I came close. You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, so when people look at it, it tends to look like the face or the head of something. And it turns out that if you look at the old Minuteman profile with their tri-corner hat and the little bun of hair in the back, that shape kind of reminds you of that Minuteman profile.
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you, because I would never have identified that. Yeah. Now, Cheshire has its own historical society.
It does.
And does it have people like yourself volunteering there?
Yes, there are 7 members of it, and we hope eventually to take some of our collection and get it on display at the town hall. Right now, it's in an old room up over our police station, and there's no way people can get up there to look at it. So that's going to be a big project, I think, in the coming years.
So you're planning on moving it to a place that's more accessible for
Exactly,
people.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Excellent. And you're going to be around to take charge of that.
Well, I won't take charge of it, but I'll assist, that's for sure.
That's sure, that's sure.
Yeah.
Barry, this has been remarkable. And then you write all these books, and every time you write one, it seems like you've got even more to add to that history.
Yeah.
And you talk about the mysteries, and you talk about what they're famous for. And primarily, I think what I'm hearing you say is that you have preserved so much of this local history.
Yeah.
Without someone like you, that stuff would be gone.
And I brought it to the attention of the people that are living there now.
Yeah.
And that's important too.
Yes, yes.
And when I give these talks, people in the room, we didn't know that about Cheshire.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's going to be there for the future, but it's also in the present.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's excellent.
Now,
That's
July 12th,
Yes,
Angela.
I want to hear about that.
I'm
July.
going to give a lecture on after the lunch at the Council on Aging.
Oh, yes.
So it's going to be at their building,
Yes.
probably starting at 12:30, and it's free, open to the public.
Sure.
And then I believe the library in Cheshire is also going to sponsor an evening talk.
Okay.
So I don't know the date for that, but at some point there'll be another talk in the evening.
Wow, I have never known anyone to give that much depth and history about a particular area. You are a gem.
Thank you.
You
Thank
are
you.
a gem, and I hope you're appreciated by everybody there. You should be. As you well know, Berkshire Family History covers a lot. We talk about family history, we talk about town history, but this is valuable information for people in the area who want to know more about this area and the people and places. But I think in this day and age, we're losing so much history. So people like yourself, Barry, and places like Berkshire Family History have that place to offer this information, because when we're gone, who's going to know?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I
It
treasure
needs to be
that.
saved. It needs to be saved
It
for
needs to
future
be
generations.
saved. Yes, yes, because it's valuable. It is so valuable.
And you know, most people, they don't get really interested in history until they get a little older.
Well, they don't have time for it earlier.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so.
Oh, this has been remarkable,
you.
Barry. I have so enjoyed hearing this and the history and your publications, and I wish you many more years of searching and finding the more histories involved in Cheshire.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you for having me on your show. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.